without further ado, this is our metabolic conditioning slides. This is actually all created by another coach and a friend of mine, Brian Quadacodal. And if you want to follow him, he's got a lot of good content on his site, on his Instagram, and it's Water Polo Strong. So either remember that or go back to this video, check out that Instagram and his, I think he's got a website. And he's got a lot of cool stuff. He also runs what's called Breathe Performance, where he's exclusively doing like metabolic assessments. And I think we'll talk about that in a minute too, but getting into it. I might just throw this out to you guys to start everything off. What is like the book definition of metabolism? It's fuel utilization, substrate utilization. One of the easiest ways that we can think about it too is it's either the mobilization of substrates to produce energy, or the other thing that people always forget is metabolism also is taking in nutrients and storing them for fuel later on. Those are both metabolism. And so it's not just how we can break down, fuel substrate in our body and use it, but also how can we actually take, new fuel nutrition coming in and store that for later use. And our ability to train and condition makes both of those processes better, which is essentially that's what conditioning is, right? It's increasing the efficiency at which we can mobilize fuel substrate for physical activity, right? So that's conditioning. But then our ability to condition and then recovering from conditioning bouts is how well we're able to use substrates to recover and then create more fuel stores for the next exercise bout. So those are both important. To that point, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but if you look on the left here, you guys can kind of recognize these, right? The ATP and creatine phosphate system, right? That's like your sprints, your sprint type activities, your high intensity, short duration, right? And that's anaerobic, mainly going to be through ATP and phosphocreatine inside the muscle itself. And then the glycolytic, there's glycolytic lactic and alactic. Glycolytic lactic is when you're actually starting to use blood sugar or glucose in the muscle at that time. That's that 20 to 40 second range. And then lactic glycolysis is when we're actually able to use glucose, mobilize it, and create more pyruvate from lactate as we do like those intermediate kind of 1 minute to 2 minute longer sprint intervals. So we're thinking moderate intensity, moderate duration. And then here's your fuel substrates on the right. And then the last one is obviously purely aerobic, where it's an extended period of time where we really start mobilizing fatty acids to create more glucose molecules. So not to hammer on that, but just kind of the timing is the huge ones on that, right? So you got your sprints, your short sprints, your moderate sprints, and then your longer duration. So we go from carbohydrate to fat utilization based on intensity and rest. So those will come back in. I'll show you why those are key when we're actually like using training methods. Okay, so one of the big things that we have to be able to do before we start training anybody, including ourselves, is getting some kind of measurement of our metabolic system. Obviously, we're not going to have a respirometer and be able to measure gas exchange rate, or unless you're at like a sports medicine center or like in a clinical setting, you're probably not going to have access to that. So if in a real world setting, we're going to use things like RPE. So I know you got right, RPE, you guys are familiar with that. This is a cool scale, and I've seen this like pinned up more often, where, scale of 1 to 10. They also do I think it's like 6 or 7 to like 18, which that one correlates directly with like heart rate. But essentially rating of perceived exertion. RPE is great too, and I'll use this for everything from actual like what you consider like cardiorespiratory training, like doing sprints on like an air bike or a row ergometer, all the way to even things like bear crawls and kettlebell swings. RPE is universal, right? What is your perceived exertion? What's the intensity that you as the individual is feeling at this time? And it's a completely valid measurement or assessment, because obviously if I take somebody, have them sprint a mile on the bike, and then have them come back again, and either at the same RPE, right, they get higher, further in distance, right? Or they get the same distance, but their RP is lower. Well, then that's a measure. I can see qualitatively if their metabolic system's actually becoming more efficient because their RPE goes down, or they can produce more work at the same RPE. So that should never be discounted. Um, Heart rate is another huge one, especially as like a trainer, as a coach. I'm sure you guys know of like Orange Theory, right? Their whole premise is like there's an orange zone, that 75 to 85% of your heart rate max is how they use and measure heart rate. So using heart rate measures are becoming much more accessible with like polar and heart strap monitors, and like even wrist monitors now, like an Apple Watch, like there's heart rate monitors in this. So using a heart rate monitor is huge. Like in the group trainings that I do in the facility, like I use heart rate a lot, especially in our assessments for our conditioning phase, once every 3 months. But when we're looking at heart rate, there's a few different things here. One is HRV. Yeah, so HRV is becoming a lot more popular. The hardest thing to measure HRV as far as a quantitative measurement of stress and metabolic tolerance and change is you need a specific type of heart rate monitor that can measure the QRS wave. So this is what your heart rate variability is. It's the distance from R to R wave. Now, our HRV, right, it's your heart rate variability. So we're looking at, if we go to the actual score here, BioForce is an HRV reading app. It can connect to the newer Apple Watches and some heart rate monitors automatically. You have to find one that says like this measures HRV. The new Polar ones do, Polar 10, Polar 11. The Apple Watch 4 and 5 do. Some of the Fitbits do, and Whoop does. You guys heard of Whoop? The wrist straps. So newer heart rate monitors can measure HRV, but what HRV helps us measure is stress tolerance and load. So the higher your variability, so that's your variability is how long this R to R length is, this R to R interval. So the variability is like, maybe this is 5 inches, and then the next beat is, or inches, millimeters, and then it goes to 4 millimeters, and then it goes to 6 millimeters, and it goes down to 3 millimeters, and it gets an average over a minute, and then it takes an average of what those heart rates are, and your variability should be high, right? So it's a logarithmic score. So, from 0 to 1, right? 1 being completely invariable and 0 being no variability at all. The higher your variability, the better measure of HRV, because a high measure of HRV means that you are in a parasympathetic state. So if you wake up in the morning, your HRV should be really high because you're sitting around not doing anything. You're not sympathetically nervous system stimulated, right? So if you're recovering well from an exercise bout, if your conditioning or your lifting or training is the right load, within a day or two, you should have that HRV be highly variable again. Does that make sense? So yeah, if we're measuring stress from an individual, we have to get a heart rate monitor. We have to make sure it measures HRV, and we want to look for a high amount of variability from that individual to tell if they are recovering from our training, from our exercise. If we're looking from a physiological metabolic conditioning standpoint. If you have somebody come in and they're low, like if you look here on the bottom, like on the far right, like less than 60 on your variability, that's low, right? That's somebody who's untrained. But if you have somebody that's also having like a higher bout of stress, like say if you come in and it's like, you've got 5x5 back squat and then like 4x10 shoulder press, and then you're doing a metabolic conditioning circuit of like 100 kettlebell swings and like 200-meter bear crawls, and that person has a variability usually between 70 and 80, and then they wake up the next morning and they're like at like 55, you know that their systems are still trash. So they have not recovered from that exercise bout. So then you can do things like performance recovery training, which we'll talk about later on. So HRV is a huge measure that we can use to gauge metabolic systems tolerance to stress, right? So HRV is measuring stress. Resting heart rate is a great measure of your overall fitness level, conditioning. I'm sure you guys do know about cardiac output. That's stroke volume times heart rate. I can't remember the all 3 factors in it as well, but it's essentially your body's your heart's ability to have a high cardiac output, right? So big forceful contractions with every beat. So that's why if you have a nice strong functioning heart wall, your heart muscle is in shape and it's conditioned, every beat is stronger, right? So you can force more blood through your body with one pump. So your resting heart rate will be lower. That makes sense. So if we're looking at an individual, there's more numbers coming up, but for those of us who are in shape, like if this is like at rest, like when you've been sitting down and when you wake up in the morning, like taking your heart rate, it should be honestly around 50, like 50 to 60. If I have clients who like are in the 70s, I tell them that's actually not good. And if you guys can remember from, I think even ACSM, if they say it's like 70, 75 is a good average heart rate. 70, 75 beats actually isn't that great, because if you imagine any kind of stress tolerance, right, even like getting up from a chair, walking up a flight of stairs, that'll push your heart rate over 100 beats per minute, which boom, automatically triggers sympathetic nervous system response. So a resting lower heart rate is better at your body's, it measures your body's overall fitness, but that's also because it's able to tolerate more stress. The lower your resting heart rate, the more ability you're able to tolerate stress. Heart rate recovery is huge. So if we're looking at like the individual's ability to recover from an exercise bout, we'll take them at like max or near max exercise bout. So like mine was, I did like 5 minutes on the air bikes or on a sled in the gym, right? Something all out intensity, like what really like gets the heart rate up to like as close as possible as somebody's true heart rate max. And then you take a 1 minute recovery score. And again, that's checking not only ventricle thickness, but also ventricle size, right? And so that's what we're measuring as far as our cardiac output. But now your body's ability to use cardiac output for recovery and pump blood and oxygen through the body in a way to actually for recovery, right? When we're in oxygen jet, post-exercise oxygen debt, right? So your heart rate recovery score is huge. It's a huge gauge of overall fitness, like mid-workout bout. So stress tolerance, right? If we're waking up in the morning, resting heart rate, overall fitness, heart rate recovery, your body's ability, like mid-workout, mid-high intensity intervals to recover from workout bout. And then this one is just training with heart rate. It can't be standardized. So in other words, like somebody's like heart rate variabilities, we have to measure, you have to take an average of the person's heart rate variability before you can use it. We can't standardize it, right? The higher is usually better, but it's based off of a standard deviation. So that's why it has to be standardized to each individual. Resting heart rate, that's pretty universal. The lower, the better. Like that's pretty much truthful throughout. But obviously, if you take somebody who's older, or I'm sorry, who's younger, right? Like a preteen, their heart rates are usually going to be higher on average, just because they're younger and growing and more physically active. And then heart rate recovery is another one where usually you're looking for about 30, but I mean, a 30 beat per minute drops is good. We'll look at the numbers in a minute here. But if that's for like us, and we're not endurance athletes, you know, it's fantastic. If I have somebody who runs like ultra marathons, they should have a heart rate recovery, like a 1 minute drop around like 60 if they're trying to compete at a high level. Because again, it just measures their body's, heart's ability to tolerate and recover from stress mid-exercise. So again, we can't standardize. And then again, if we're working on like a percentage of our heart rate max, you have to take obviously percentage is usually universal, right? So if we have somebody who's 60, somebody who's 40, and somebody who's 30, their heart rate maxes are all going to be different. And like if we're working them out at 70% of their heart rate max, we can work them out at 70% because that's going to be in that aerobic to anaerobic kind of threshold right there. But obviously that number is going to be different for everybody. So just keep that that in mind, where you want to actually measure somebody's resting heart rate, get HRV if you can, and then their heart rate recovery, so you have baseline to gauge their improvement, right? So it's specific for individuals. So get those numbers. This is resting heart rate. The lower the heart rate, the better, right? And it's just kind of a key point if we're talking about a specific population. If we have, again, a high level athlete and their resting heart rate is like 60, 70, like that's not good. It means that their fitness needs to be better, right? If I have like a football player or a soccer player, and you know they're at home on the weekend, they come in to train and they've had all weekend to recover and they're like 68, 69 beats per minute, that means that their fitness probably needs more work. Because that's like if I just had an average person that was coming to the gym, that's probably fine, right? They're below that 70 range and the 60 range. But if I have somebody who's going to push himself, we want to get that heart rate down. So again, just consider who you're working with. But yeah, lower the better on our heart rate when we're looking at that. This graph right here is just showing you where heart rate recovery score should be. So if we're looking at, so here, right here, this is a peak exercise. So as close to heart rate max as possible. And then post, that's 30 seconds. This is 1 minute post bout. If we have a person that's trained, person that's untrained, they're at about 190 beats per minute. If we go look at a 1 minute recovery score, this person drops 60 who's trained, right? We're talking about our heart rate recovery. They should have a beats per minute drop somewhere around 30 plus, 40 plus. The untrained individual we look at, and it's like 20 beats per minute. So obviously the less trained somebody is, that heart rate recovery score is going to be lower, but we want that heart rate recovery score to be higher, because that again tells us the body's ability to use the heart to pump oxygenated blood back to the tissue and recover. So heart rate recovery is another huge number. It's hard to get though, because you're going to have to push somebody through something like a Bruce treadmill protocol, a Wingate, something that's all out, and then you're going to have to take recovery. For me, I make it fun in the gym. We use like sleds, and they have to go like as far as they can for time in 5 minutes, or like 100 ball slams for time, right? So in a gym, we can we don't have to put them on a treadmill. We just want to have them do something that's going to push themselves so that we can get the heart rate up and measure recovery. Okay, using heart rate during training as a workload, right? So if we're talking about working at, we're going to lift really heavy, and then by the time you're done recovering, your heart rate should drop. You should be back within like, 60-65% of your heart rate max, right? If we're talking about using percentages as a form of workload. If you're trying to take somebody through cardiac output method training, which we'll talk about in the end here or in a little later, that's looking at something like steady state cardio. That's where it's like, oh, like if you're doing like jogging, boxers and MMA fighters call it road work, where it's just slow jogging, right? Or hiking in the hills, going on a bike ride. They say, you want to be around 60-65% of your heart rate max. So for us, it's probably somewhere around, 140, 150. And so that's going to be when we're doing steady state work, we want that 60-65% max. So we can monitor steady state for heart rate as a function of workload, right? So I'll take myself on a bike ride, look at my watch, and I should be around 140, 150 if I'm doing steady state heart rate training. And likewise, if I see myself climbing up to like 170s, 180s, I know I'm trying to push more towards my anaerobic threshold, so I should slow myself down, because the intent there is to hit aerobic threshold, cardiac output training, which is primarily aerobic in nature. And that'll make a little bit more sense when I break down the different types of metabolic conditioning workouts at the end. RPE, we talked about that. You can tell somebody's workload by how fatigued they are in a given work bout. And then again, their heart rate recovery, right? What is their ability to recover in between work sets? So looking at metabolic conditioning, when we start, this paradigm here, Coach X, my friend who made these slides, put this continuum together. I agree with it. It just needs a little bit of explanation. So if we are working with an individual, one of the first things we're going to do is put them in a conditioning emphasis of just being able to control their breathing, right? So if like you get somebody on a treadmill for the first time, or like a bike, and you're doing like, I'll do assessments like a history and an injury background, and I'll talk to them, and they're just walking maybe like 2 miles per hour on a tread at like 2% incline, and they're just and that's usually a sign that they have not been able to tap into using their diaphragmatic floor to control respiration, right? They're still used to just breathing, gasping for air, like the same way that people do when we just sit all day behind a desk, right? We breathe. I'm sorry. We're going through respiration. We're not trying to actually breathe, right? We're not thinking like trying to control heart rate and things like that. So when we have somebody go, we want to use kind of lighter conditioning methods so that they can really focus on the breathing. Because if we cannot get oxygen into the lungs, it won't be able to get into the blood and then into that left ventricle and then disperse through the rest of the body, right? So if someone can't breathe properly, we're not going to be able to work on any conditioning systems. From there, we go to motor control. Motor control is huge too, because then we're talking about the efficiency of a movement pattern. I think we were talking about this, I can't remember if it was last week with the core talk, Dave, when you were on there, but we were talking about how essentially when somebody starts to use the proper muscles and the proper motor sequencing when they're trying to execute some activity, RPE goes down, efficiency goes up, oxygen debt goes down, right? Because they're becoming more efficient at doing the movement, right? And you can see this a lot with little kids when you train little kids. They start to learn to, like, for instance, get up from the floor more efficiently. Burpees, I'm not a huge fan of doing it as a form of conditioning. However, you teach somebody how to kind of like peel up from the floor, brace themselves. They all of a sudden become more efficient. The motor pattern has become enhanced, and so they know what muscles to use when to brace, when to relax, so they're not burning as many calories. So we teach an individual to breathe, go through diaphragmatic breathing and not just respire when they're exercising, then focus on the motor control of what different skills we're trying to implement for our conditioning systems. And then recovery is where we're starting to work at some of these individuals where if we're working on mainly our aerobic components here, as soon as we start to get to recoveries, when we introduce the anaerobic components and the lactic components, where we're going more high intensity and we're giving time for them to actually focus on, using breath to recover from a high intensity bout. Right. So you never really want to start off training somebody on a higher intensity, like interval training style, because it's hard on the body, right? They don't have motor control and their breathing's not on point. So when they're during those recovery phases, it's going to be all over the place. So it's not an efficient form of conditioning for that individual. Sure, it'll make them tired, but then we're not actually getting them to a position where their body's going to be at, the nervous system's not going to be able to better adapt and use heart rate variability and monitor heart rate variability, go from sympathetic to parasympathetic state of nervous system innervation. And then they're going to go from obviously things like increasing capillary density, mitochondrial efficiency, how well we can utilize substrates. So if we don't work on these first, recovery is going to be trash. So that's why recovery comes third. And then when we get to pattern conditioning base, that's when we're looking at things like doing like a CrossFit style WOD, right? Or a Metcon, where it's like you're doing, barbell cleans or kettlebell swings or something like that for time, right? Your pattern conditioning. So there's a certain pattern and we're trying to make that more conditioned, right? So if you guys, I'm not sure if you do follow my account, my social media account, I'll do pattern conditioning just like on localized tissue. So on arms, on shoulders, on your core, on knee extensors. That's when we start to condition patterns. Or like bear crawls, that's another good one. Kettlebell swings. We can start to work certain patterns. Think like in football, they do gassers, right? Like down and backs, 50 yards, or like 5-10-5 drill. That's a pattern. That's cutting and changing direction. Now that they have these first prerequisites done, we can start to condition that pattern specifically. Advanced conditioning, the layperson's probably not going to do this. Advanced conditioning is when somebody has these other 4 tenets all kind of down. They can breathe, they have good movement and control when they're working. They have the ability to recover and understand what that is. They've done enough of patterning where they can actually start to do it under load. Advanced conditioning is when you're actually starting to do it like in game. Right. So we're talking about an athlete who, like a soccer player who has to get used to, 45 minutes of work with high intensity bouts with steady state recovery. Right. That's very functional. But that's advanced. You're not going to take, the average soccer mom, bring her in and be like, all right, we're going to move for 45 minutes and I'm going to keep, throwing in burpees and kettlebell swings, all this stuff. And, you're already under stress. Your breathing's going to go, your motor control is going to go bye. You don't have the ability to recover, and all of a sudden your movement patterns are breaking down. I'm not going to push that intensity. And so there's still stuff open. Like you could still do, like in this area here, you can still do things like battling ropes, air bikes. You can still have some fun with it. But just like those higher movement patterns, like change direction drills, high level barbell drills, like the snatch and the clean, those will be saved for over here. And if people need and want it, right? And again, always using things like your HRV, resting heart rate and heart rate recovery to gauge if you are giving the proper load and your client or yourself is recovering from bout to bout properly. And that's this slide right here. So we want the ability to super compensate from a workout bout. Where this little dip right here is us taking water out of the bucket, right? And then this here is allowing time to fill the bucket back up and then becoming more efficient at, emptying and filling the bucket. But what these 3 lines represent is too little, too much, and just the right amount. So like the baby bear, I'm sorry, the baby bear, mama bear, papa bears, where if we go too little, if this is recovery bout, this is the next training session right here. And so if we come and somebody all of a sudden they super compensates, or it's too low of a super compensation arc, it's not going to help us with our next workout bout. And that's what I tell a lot of people who just come into the gym to work out. They never push this part of the intensity, so they never have the super compensation that allows them to have more performance the next time they come in to train. Conversely to that, we have too hard of a workout where this recovery time is so lag that they have to wait until past their next exercise bout to get that increase in performance, or possibly not even get the increase in performance because the performance drop was too great to begin with, or they don't allow things like recovery either with nutrition, rest, sleep. They don't take that into consideration, so then they miss this optimal window of when their next training bout is, so they can use the increase in performance to then keep adding. Because then if somebody's up here and they train again, well, then they have that dip again, and then it adds up again. So we just kind of go on this little roller coaster where it slowly gets higher and higher, as if we program things correctly. All right. This right here is just similar. This is through Kind Performance, but this talks about how motion and strength, like these are the kind of systems you'd want to use. So if you're working, speed, strength, or if you're building motor control, you're going to be really focusing on kind of either some localized steady state work, or you can actually do high intensity work, but with long periods of recovery, because that is still primarily aerobic in nature. Like we have a quick burst where we're using that ATP creatine phosphate system, right? That's localized to the muscle. So thinking like sets of 2 to 3 cleans or 1 back squat, but then we take like 2-3 minutes to recover. And so it's our oxidative aerobic system that's actually helping that ability to recover in between reps, right? So that's still like primarily actually an oxidative aerobic method of training, even though we're doing high intensity, but only for like a 5-10 second bout. This right here, when we're talking about really getting into a lactic interval where we have prolonged exposure to oxidative stress and we need to convert lactate into pyruvate so that we can get it into the Krebs cycle and use oxygen for intermediate amount of bouts, that should be limited, right? And that's when we're talking about performance. And I told you a second ago with this slide here, some people may not even ever get to this position. Like for myself, I don't even really fuck with this unless I have to. Like if I'm doing like, I want a PR on a lift, or if I'm like have like a race, like a mud run or like a Spartan race, something like that coming up, that's when I'll start working into lactic thresholds. But for the most part, even myself, I'm right here going mainly aerobic, anaerobic, was it a creatine phosphate system, or alactic anaerobic systems, which is like 60 seconds of work. But these are all the different styles of training that you can do and the effect that it has on the metabolic system. So right here, this is the method. Right here, this is your RPE. This is the explanation of how it's done. This is the exercise implementation of what you can use. And then this is the frequency, how many times a week you're going to be doing it. So cardiac output is essentially like steady road training, right? It's hopping on a treadmill or a bike and doing like 20, 30, 60 minutes of, continuous low intensity exercise. And we can do that many times. We can do that almost every day. So about, 1 to 4 times a week. But then we're looking at just maintaining a certain output at a certain speed, right? Because we're talking moderate intensity, but a lot of volume, right? A higher duration, right? As we call it road work. It's like grinding out miles on the road. That's usually pretty tolerant on the body. One quick note, see out here it says jogging, jumping rope, etc. I usually try to keep that low impact, unless it's somebody like a runner, so that the joints aren't taking the brunt of, foot striking every time somebody's having to do, this 30 plus 60 minutes plus of cardiac output work. Tempo intervals are higher intensity. So we're getting up to like 70-80% of maximum intensity. So if we're looking at like a clean, like if I have a 300-pound clean, this is me doing a, probably like a 250-pound clean, but then I rest for about 60 seconds. So I have that quick power output, right? Or if we're using like a bike again, maybe I get this hard bit of work, maybe around, I don't know, 80% of my heart rate max, and then I take a very long amount of recovery. Because again, what we're looking at here is your heart rate's, your heart's ability to recover in between reps. So high intensity, but enough time that you can drop that heart rate steadily. And then high resistance intervals. So these are similar, except what we're looking at here is the heart rate itself. So we want to keep our heart rate, it says 130 to 140 beats per minute, but you're looking at about 65%. So we go maximum intensity, but rather than just rating for about a 1 minute time frame, we're actually taking a heart rate monitor. So you can't do this without a heart rate monitor. And then we're going to try to see if when that drop occurs, we do the next exercise bout. And that's measuring, you know, our ability to get a certain intensity, a certain number of reps, and then while we keep dropping to a certain goal heart rate that we have. And then high intensity continuous. This is where it's like, the best example I have is you take like a spin bike, you crank up the resistance as high as you can, and everyone feels like a separate leg press. So we're talking about like climbing uphill, a Versa climber, a bike, something like that, where we are continuously having high amounts of intensity, but it's for a longer duration. So not as long as a cardiac output method. So we're not going 30, 60 minutes. We're maybe going 5 or 10 minutes. So right here it says, 5 to 20 minutes total, and it's high intensity. So we're checking if we can maintain intensity now. So in cardiac output, we're not looking at intensity, just the time. Now we're trying to maintain intensity at a certain amount of time. Right, so our fast twitch muscles' ability to maintain force over a given duration of time. Intensive intervals, so that's similar to these tempo intervals, except the difference with this one is we have less recovery now. So this is when we start to go to that like perform training movements and getting more into the performance side of cardiac, not cardiac, but metabolic conditioning systems. So 5-10 seconds of all out maximal work, let the heart rate drop, maybe some active rest, so like riding a bike, or maybe some, you know, just walking around, and repeated explosive bouts, so like jump squats, sprints, double unders, burpees, things like that. And then what we're checking right there is how many reps, how many high intensity reps can we get while we're doing that work. Extensive intervals is the same idea, except this is a little bit longer. So rather than going 5 to 10 seconds, we're looking at a minute, 45, 60 seconds. It's 30 to 60 seconds. And we're taking about a 3 to 5 minute recovery. So again, the amount of volume we can get in 1 minute amount of time. And that's going to, again, we're checking the distance covered, and then we're really working on our heart rate's ability to recover in that 1 to 3 minute recovery period. Threshold training is when we're trying to actually raise our anaerobic threshold, right? At what speed, what intensity is our anaerobic system starting to tap out, and our aerobic system starting to kick in. So this you can only do when you have your anaerobic threshold for a certain training style. So like doing a VO2 max on like a treadmill or on a bike, because then you have to use your anaerobic threshold and train at that intensity for 3 to 5 minutes at a time. And the last one is cardiac power. How intense can we make a certain bout for as long as we can? Right, so that's the heart's ability to maintain force for about a 60 second to 2 minute bout of exercise with a long recovery period. This right here is just talking about the difference between, so this is your aerobic systems, this is kind of your alactic or your threshold systems, and this is when we're getting lactic or really into high intensity stuff. And then we're looking at periodization. Here's the rules. Intensity goes up, duration down, and vice versa. This is talking about how many times a week you want to do each type of training. This is giving the rest to work ratios of what does each. So high performance recovery training, so that's your city cardio. Stimulation is that kind of lactic or alactic, and then this development is the lactic or full on sprints. And these last two right here, you guys see, that's the cardiac output method: Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. This is the periodization, and then this is the periodization for an advanced trainee.